Dedalus Diggle had been hiding behind a tin of baked beans for 11 minutes, and he was fairly certain the beans knew it. The shop was a Muggle establishment of the kind that sold everything and none of it particularly well. Tinned goods in mismatched stacks, a refrigerated section humming at the far end, paper bags already turning translucent with the weight of what had been put inside them. The fluorescent lights did something disagreeable to color. Diggle's violet top hat, which had never once in his life failed to spark delight in a wizarding crowd, was receiving looks of a different order here. He had pulled it low. It had not helped. He was on rotation. That was the word Dumbledore had used, rotation, as though their collective grief and bewilderment had been organized into something that resembled a schedule. 2 afternoons a week, someone from their diminished and disbanded number was to be in the vicinity of Little Whinging Surrey, keeping an eye out for anything extraordinary, for anything wrong, for the boy. Diggle had drawn this particular afternoon, which meant he had spent 40 minutes in the car park outside pretending to examine a trolley, and then another 11 in this aisle, under fluorescent light, behind baked beans, waiting for nothing in particular to happen. He was not good at waiting. Everyone who knew him acknowledged this, usually by implication. McGonagall had said it once directly. She had said a number of things directly. She was a woman who did not squander indirection, and one of those things, delivered during a meeting 3 years ago when Dumbledore had first explained the arrangements, had been that Dedalus Diggle had never had much sense. She hadn't said it unkindly exactly. She'd said it the way one states that a well-meaning spaniel cannot be trusted near pastries, as a simple fact of the world that everyone present would be better for acknowledging. She was not wrong. He knew she was not wrong. He reached past the baked beans and picked up a tin of something tomato-adjacent and tried to read the label, which told him considerably more about tomatoes than he had ever needed to know. The bell above the shop door rang. A family of 3 came in. Diggle did not look up immediately. He had developed, over the course of this rotation and the 3 before it, a system. Do not look at every entrance. Wait for the sound of a family to settle into the aisles, then glance carefully from underneath the brim of the hat. Most of the time it was nothing. A woman with a pram, a man in overalls, the teenagers who always seemed to be buying crisps and nothing else. He glanced. The father was large, red-faced, and mustached in the way of a man who considered the mustache a form of personality. He walked with the forward-leaning momentum of someone accustomed to taking up more space than the aisle technically offered. The woman beside him was thin and horse-faced, with the neck of someone who had spent a great deal of time craning in the direction of other people's business. Between them, or rather behind them, slightly, at the distance that suggested neither party had arranged it but only one of them minded, was a small boy. Diggle's hand went still on the tomato tin. The boy was thin, in a way that was less about age and more about insufficiency, the kind of thin that happens not to children generally, but to children who have been given less than they needed for long enough that the lack had become structural. His hair was black and wholly untamable, sticking up at the back with the cheerful indifference of hair that had long ago stopped paying attention to gravity. He was wearing a shirt that was not his. This was immediately apparent because the shirt was enormous. Not slightly large, not growing room large, but vast, a sail of grey fabric drooping from his shoulders and reaching nearly to his knees, evidently belonging to the bigger, redder, heartier child that the family had apparently assigned all wardrobe consideration to. The boy trotted behind his aunt and uncle. He was looking at a display of boxed cereals with the concentrated attention of someone who was not going to be permitted to choose any of them. Diggle's chest did something that he had not entirely authorized. He had thought, they had all thought, or at least he had assumed the others had, that the Dursleys would be decent. Difficult, perhaps. Muggle, certainly. A bit blank about the magical world, inevitably, in the way that all Muggles were blank about it, as though the whole of what Diggle had spent his life in had simply never existed. He had assumed that beneath the blankness there would be something ordinary and adequate. A kitchen with meals in it, a bedroom with a door, an aunt who was not warm but was not cruel. The shirt said something he hadn't been prepared for. Then the boy's fringe shifted, caught by some motion of the head as he reached toward the cereal box, and then thought better of it, and Diggle saw the scar. The lightning bolt scar on the forehead of Harry James Potter was the most famous mark in the wizarding world. Every witch and wizard alive knew what it looked like. They had described it to each other at dinner tables and in pub corners for 4 years, speaking of it in hushed and reverent tones as the proof of something miraculous and terrible. Diggle had imagined it abstract somehow, had thought of it as a symbol, the way one thinks of a symbol on a flag. He had not thought of it as a small mark on the forehead of a small boy reaching toward a cereal box in a Muggle shop in Surrey. The boy's eyes were green, bright green, startling in that fluorescent light, in that unremarkable aisle. Lily Potter's eyes. Everyone who had known Lily Potter said that. The specific luminous green of them was one of the things people remembered most clearly. Diggle had known Lily Potter. Not well, not as James had known her, not as the inner circle had known her, but well enough to know that he was looking at Lily's eyes in a boy wearing a shirt that was not his, trailing behind people who had not looked back once since they entered. He could not help it. He had never been particularly good at helping it, with anything. He bowed. It was not a graceful bow. It was the bow of a man who has been crouching behind tinned goods for 11 minutes and who has discovered rather abruptly that his heart has overridden the rest of him. He straightened his hat with one hand and bent at the waist with the formal sincerity of someone who has attended enough wizarding ceremonies to know that the bow matters even when the recipient is 4 years old and staring at cereal, perhaps especially then. The boy saw him. The boy's eyes went wide, green, wide, and briefly, brilliantly delighted. And then the boy turned to his uncle. "You see that man, Uncle Vernon? He bowed to me." Vernon Dursley looked at Diggle. His expression did not change precisely, but something moved behind his small eyes. Not recognition, but the instinct of a man who does not know what he is looking at and knows, without knowing why he knows, that he does not like it. He made a sound that was almost a word. Then, to the boy, without lowering his eyes from Diggle, "Get away from that man, Harry." Harry's face did the thing that faces do when a door closes. Not dramatically, not with tears or protest, not with the theatrical deflation of a child denied something they wanted badly. Something quieter than that, and therefore harder to watch. The small, practiced recession of a child who has learned to put hope away quickly, because the longer it stays, the more it costs when it goes. He turned from Diggle. He followed his uncle down the aisle. Diggle watched them go. He watched the too large shirt move around the corner. He watched the back of the boy's head, the hair that would not lie flat, and the scar that was no longer visible, and the hands at the boy's sides that were small and thin-wristed and carefully not reaching for anything. Then they were gone. The shop continued around him. The fluorescent lights continued their disagreeable business with color. Someone's trolley squeaked on the lino somewhere near the refrigerated section. Diggle stood in the aisle with his violet hat and his tin of tomato-adjacent produce, and he thought, with a clarity that was unusual for him and therefore alarming, "I have to tell someone what I just saw, not just the scar. Not just the confirmation that the boy was alive and present and in Surrey on an ordinary afternoon. That, Dumbledore already knew. That was the entire point of the rotation. He had to tell someone about the shirt, about the way Harry had turned away after his uncle's instruction without argument or hesitation, as though argument had been educated out of him by this point. About the green eyes going briefly wide and then, carefully, deliberately even, in a child too young to be deliberate about such things, not wide. He had to tell someone that the boy who had survived Voldemort was trailing behind his relatives in a shirt that could have served as rigging, and that when someone had seen him, when someone had looked at him directly, even accidentally, even from behind a tin of baked beans in a fluorescent-lit aisle, his face had done something luminous and brief before it had been put away again. Diggle had never had much sense. He understood this about himself with the equanimity of a man who has lived with a fact long enough to stop arguing with it. But he had, in the way of people who do not have much sense, a very clear instinct about when something mattered. He replaced the tomato tin on the shelf. He straightened his hat. He left the shop. Outside, the ordinary Surrey afternoon continued without interest in him. He did not notice it. He was already thinking about who he needed to find and what he was going to say when he found them, and whether the words he had available would be anywhere near adequate for what he had seen in that boy's face in the half-second before the door had closed. He suspected they wouldn't be. He was going to try anyway. Dedalus Diggle's owl arrived at an hour that Minerva McGonagall considered unsuitable for owls, which was to say, it arrived while she was teaching. The message, when she read it between her third-year class and her fourth, said 3 things. The first was that Diggle needed to speak with the headmaster urgently. The second was that he had asked for McGonagall to be present. The third, and the one she found herself returning to as she climbed the stairs to Dumbledore's office that afternoon, was his phrasing of the reason. Not that he had information, but that he had seen something. Something, he had written, as though the word for it had not quite arrived yet. She was told later that Diggle had spent an hour and 40 minutes getting from Surrey to Hogwarts. She did not ask how. She had learned, over 25 years of knowing Dedalus Diggle, that there were matters one was better off not inquiring into too precisely. Dumbledore was already in his office when she arrived. He had been in his office, she suspected, for some time before Diggle's message. He had the particular quality of stillness about him that suggested a man who had arranged his surroundings and settled himself before company came. He was seated at his desk with his long, silver-bearded chin resting on steepled fingers, his half-moon spectacles catching the last of the afternoon light, and he looked at McGonagall when she entered with an expression she could not quite read, and had given up trying to after the first several decades. "Minerva," he said, by way of greeting and nothing more. She sat in the chair she had always sat in, the one in front of his desk and slightly to the left, where the angle meant she could see both him and the door. Then they waited. Diggle arrived 11 minutes later, still wearing the violet top hat, which he apparently considered appropriate indoor headwear in all circumstances. He was slightly out of breath. He had, she noticed, retained a sprig of something that might have been a Muggle parking machine's printed receipt in his outer robe pocket, and he had not noticed. She did not say anything about it. "Right," said Diggle, dropping into the remaining chair and pulling his hat off in the same motion, revealing hair that had been subjected to the hat for several hours and bore the evidence. He held the hat in his lap. "Right. I want to say first that I know this isn't what the arrangement was for. I know I was supposed to observe and not get involved, not do anything that would draw attention, and I know a bow is the opposite of—" "Dedalus," Dumbledore said gently. Diggle stopped. Then he told them what he had seen. McGonagall had taught for long enough to know the difference between a man who is reporting information and a man who has been altered by it. Diggle was of the second variety. He kept his eyes on the desk, or somewhere near the desk, as he spoke. The shirt that had belonged to another child entirely, the small particular thinness of the boy's wrists, the way Harry Potter had looked at his uncle and then looked away from what his uncle's expression had told him. The green eyes, the scar, glimpsed for a moment and then covered by a fringe that hadn't been combed. He described Vernon Dursley's voice as though still hearing it, flat and certain and disposing of the subject in 4 words. He did not editorialize much for Diggle. He seemed to understand, without being told, that the facts were sufficient. When he finished, the office was quiet for a moment. Said Dumbledore. McGonagall looked at him. He did not seem surprised. This was the thing that she kept returning to, over the days and weeks that followed, that Dumbledore had heard Diggle's account of a thin, poorly dressed child wearing clothes that didn't belong to him, watched over by adults who spoke to him as though he were an inconvenience to be managed, and he had said, in the way of a man encountering information that broadly confirmed what he had already suspected. Not in the way of a man who had just learned something he had not known. "Thank you, Dedalus," Dumbledore said. "You were right to come." Diggle looked as though he had expected something more and didn't quite know what. He turned his hat in his hands. He said, "Is he all right?" Which was, McGonagall thought, both the most obvious question in the room and the one that no one else had said aloud yet. "He is safe," Dumbledore said. "Safe," Diggle repeated. He seemed to be testing the word. McGonagall set her hands flat on her knees and said carefully, "What exactly does keeping him safe mean in that house, Albus?" Dumbledore turned to look at her with the measured attentiveness of a man who had been waiting for this question and had prepared his answer and was now deciding how much of the preparation to show. "It means what it has always meant," he said. "Lily's protection. The ancient magic she created when she chose to stand between Harry and Voldemort's curse. While Harry lives with Petunia, while he calls that house home, the protection holds. No dark magic can touch him there. No remnant of Voldemort's power, however it reconstitutes itself, can reach him at 4 Privet Drive." "I am aware of the theory," McGonagall said. "It is not theory." "I am aware." She kept her voice level. It cost her. "What I am asking is not about the magical protection. I am asking about the other conditions. The boy is being dressed in clothes that do not fit him and that were not bought for him. He is being housed." She paused, because the word she wanted was one she was not certain she should use until she had more than Diggle's impression of a thin child in a shop. And she was a woman who chose her words carefully. "He is being housed somewhere. I'm asking whether you know what somewhere means in that house on an ordinary evening." Dumbledore did not answer immediately. Outside, one of the portraits shifted in its frame. She did not look. "I know the Dursleys are not warm people," he said at last. "I knew that in 1981. You knew it in 1981, she said, and you placed a child with them. I placed Harry with the only people whose blood could anchor Lily's protection to a location. The magic requires that connection. It cannot be replicated elsewhere." "The magic requires it, you've said." "Yes. And if the magic is what keeps him safe," she looked at him, and she was aware of Diggle sitting very still between them, holding his hat like a man who has started something considerably larger than he intended. "Then I would like to know what we are calling it when a small boy is dressed in clothes that could fit two of him, and tells the one stranger who looked at him directly in recent memory about it in the first 5 seconds, because apparently no one else in his daily life has done anything worth noticing." The blue eyes behind the half-moon spectacles regarded her steadily. "You are calling it," Dumbledore said, "the cost." She absorbed this. "The cost," she said. "There are 3 reasons Harry must remain at Privet Drive." He said it with the composed precision of a man for whom the 3 reasons have long since become load-bearing structures of a decision he will not revisit. "The first, you know, the blood protection. The second is that Harry must not grow up knowing who he is to the wizarding world. A boy raised on the knowledge of his own legend would arrive at Hogwarts already deformed by it. Children worshipped are not happy children. They are children who have had to become the thing that is worshipped instead of being permitted to simply be themselves. The Dursleys' ignorance, whatever else it is, does not include celebrating him for something he does not yet understand." "You could tell him the truth," McGonagall said. "Who his parents were, what they did. You could tell him that without also telling him that statues have been erected in his honor in town squares across the country." Silence. That had landed. She filed the silence away. "The third reason," Dumbledore continued, "is obscurity. Harry Potter in a wizarding household is a target. In Little Whinging Surrey, he is a boy in a shop." "He is a boy in a shop being told to get away from a man who bowed to him," Diggle said quietly, to the space slightly above the desk. Both of them looked at him. He had the expression of someone who has said a thing he didn't plan to say and is not sorry. Dumbledore regarded Diggle for a moment with something that might, in another man, have been called discomfort. "I will," he said finally. "Write to Petunia again." "A letter," McGonagall said. "A reminder of what she knows, of what she accepted, when she accepted Harry onto her doorstep. She understood then what was at stake. She will be reminded." McGonagall stood. There was nothing else to do. Not yet. Not until she had more than one impulsive man's account from a shop aisle. Not until she had something more solid than impression and instinct to put before the most immovable man she had ever known. She had learned, over decades of disagreeing with Albus Dumbledore, that he could only be moved by evidence assembled with care. And she did not yet have enough of it. She would get it. "A letter," she said again, as a statement of record rather than an argument. And she left. Behind her, she heard Diggle say something too quietly to catch, and heard Dumbledore's answer, equally quiet. The sound of the phoenix on its perch shifted, a small settling of wings. She was halfway down the first staircase before she realized Diggle was still holding his violet hat when she'd walked out and had probably not put it back on and was probably sitting there still holding it, not quite sure what he had started. Neither was she, but she was beginning to be sure that starting it had been right. The address McGonagall had been given was a set of lodgings above a chemist's in a town whose name Remus Lupin had chosen, she suspected, for the twin virtues of being inexpensive and being somewhere no one was likely to come looking for him. The staircase up from the chemist's entrance had a quality of determined grimness, as though it had absorbed the character of everyone who had climbed it over the years and found the average uninspiring. She climbed it anyway. He opened the door before she knocked. He had the look still of someone who had heard the footstep on the third from top stair and made the rapid, practiced assessment of a man who has learned to distinguish between threatening arrivals and harmless ones before the knock. When he saw her, something in his face eased, not brightened exactly. Brightness was not among the things Remus Lupin was doing easily in October of 1985. But the particular quality of readiness that had been in his shoulders when he'd opened the door released itself, and he stepped back and said, "Professor McGonagall," in the voice of someone who has not spoken to another person today. "Remus," she said, and went in. She had been prepared, going up the stairs, for the room to be modest. She had not quite been prepared for it to be so thoroughly stripped of anything that wasn't strictly necessary. There was a bed against one wall, neatly made, and a table with one chair at it, and a bookshelf that was doing its earnest best with a collection of volumes that were clearly the survivors of a great many moves and showed it in their spines. There was a kettle. There was, she noticed, a second cup beside it, which meant he had put it out when he heard her on the stairs. He gestured at the table's chair and made the universal gesture of a man indicating that he would sort out somewhere to sit in a moment, and retrieved a second chair from what appeared to be behind the door. "Tea," he said, already at the kettle. "Thank you." She sat and watched him move around the small space with the efficient economy of someone who has been alone long enough to have learned all the shortcuts. His robes were clean but worn past the point where cleaning helped much. His light brown hair was slightly too long and had the look of hair that had been cut by the person wearing it in a mirror without a great deal of ceremony. He was 25 years old. She was aware of this in the abstract way one is aware of arithmetic. She had known him since he was 11, watched him become whatever he had managed to become in the 4 years since the world had rearranged itself around his grief, and the math of it sat uncomfortably alongside the evidence of the room. He brought the tea and sat in the second chair with his own cup and looked at her steadily. He had always had that quality, a capacity for waiting without fidgeting, for sitting with a silence until it became clear whether the other person intended to fill it or not. Patience born of having had to be patient about things that did not bear patience well. "Something's happened," he said. "Yes," she said, though perhaps not in the way that word usually implies. She set her cup down. "A few weeks ago, Dedalus Diggle was on his watching rotation in a Muggle shop near Little Whinging. He saw Harry." She watched the stillness happen in Lupin's face. It was not the stillness of a man with nothing in him. It was the opposite, the particular quality of someone who has put a great deal of effort into keeping the surface level and is putting more of it in now. "He's well?" Lupin said. "He's alive," she said, because she was not going to lie to him, and because she thought he deserved the precision. "Diggle brought his account to Dumbledore. I was present for the report." She told him what Diggle had described. She kept it to what she knew rather than what she suspected, which was the method she had decided on before she came. Remus Lupin did not need additional weight piled on what was already there. He needed facts, specifically arranged so he could hold them and understand them and not simply be crushed by them. She told him about the shirt, using Diggle's exact phrase because Diggle's exact phrase was better than anything she would have chosen. A sale. She told him about Vernon's voice and the 4 words. She told him about the way Harry had looked back before he turned away. Then she told him about the cupboard. This had come not from Diggle but from a conversation she had conducted 2 days after the meeting in Dumbledore's office with the woman on Wisteria Walk, though she was not yet ready to explain that conversation in full. What mattered now was the fact, and the fact was that Harry Potter, at 4 years old, was sleeping in the cupboard beneath the Dursleys' staircase. She said it straightforwardly, without preface, because there was no arrangement of words that made it easier, and she didn't think the attempt would serve either of them. Lupin said nothing. He looked at a point on the table between them. His hands were around his cup. He did not move for long enough that she could see the tendons in his hands shift once, slightly, as though something had moved through them and been very deliberately not allowed further passage. "I assumed," he said at last, "that they were decent." She waited. "I knew they were Muggle. I knew they weren't. I knew they didn't understand it, any of it, and that Harry would have to grow up without knowing because that was what Dumbledore decided. But I assumed. I think I needed to assume." He set the cup down carefully. "I haven't written to anyone about Harry. I haven't asked anyone for a report or gone to see for myself or done anything at all. I was here, and I assumed it was fine, because the alternative required me to know that it wasn't fine and that I couldn't do anything about it. And that is a considerably more difficult thing to get up in the morning inside of." "Yes," McGonagall said. "He's in a cupboard." "Yes." He stood, which in the small room meant that he took 3 steps to the window and stood looking out at a view of rooftops and a gray October sky. She let him. She had grown accustomed, across the years of knowing him, to the fact that Lupin's grief did not perform itself. It went somewhere interior and rearranged the furniture, and then he came back. "I can't grieve, James," he said, without turning. "I can't. I keep trying to find a way to do it properly, and I can't. Because the story I was given has Sirius in it, and I can't hold Sirius in the story the way the story says I should, because he was one of us. He was one of the only people left from that time. And I don't know how to put the James I knew next to what Sirius is supposed to have done and make it cohere, so I just don't. I put it away. And Lily, I can grieve for Lily more cleanly because the shape of it is clearer. But James." He stopped. "Harry is the only piece of James and Lily that's still going. And he's in a cupboard. He's in a cupboard with spiders, probably, and clothes that don't fit him, and every morning he has to climb out of it and be in a house with people who speak to him in Vernon Dursley's voice, and I've been sitting here for 4 years assuming it was fine." "You didn't know," McGonagall said. "I didn't ask." He turned then, and she could see in his face the particular quality of tiredness that is not the tiredness of one bad night, but of a great many accumulated ones, and the scars along his jaw, and the fact that he was 25. "What can we do?" She had known this was where the conversation would arrive. She had been thinking, in the days since Dumbledore's office, about how to explain it. Not the what, which was simple, but the specific way in which the simple thing contained inside itself the entire shape of their helplessness. "Nothing that removes him," she said. "That's the boundary Dumbledore will not move on. And I have looked at it from every angle I can find, and I cannot make it move either. Lily's magic holds so long as Harry calls that house home. The moment he is removed permanently, the moment he goes to live somewhere else, the charm is broken. And whatever is left of Voldemort, however formless, however scattered, is still out there. The magic Lily gave him is the only protection we can be certain of. If we take him out of that house, we take away the thing she died to give him." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one had a quality of weight to it that the others hadn't, as though the logic had entered the room and occupied a particular amount of space. "So the same magic that's supposed to be keeping him safe," Lupin said slowly, "is also the thing that keeps us from doing anything about what safe actually looks like." "Yes, that's—" He stopped. "Yes," she said again, because she had sat with the same observation for a week now and had not been able to finish the sentence either. He stood at the window for another moment. Then he came back to the table and sat and picked up his tea and said nothing more about it. She did not press him. There was nothing to press him toward. She left 20 minutes later, when the tea was done. He walked her to the door and said goodbye in the voice of a man storing something away in a place where he would know where to find it. On the staircase down, she passed someone on their way up, a woman with shopping bags who paid her no attention whatsoever in the easy way of Muggles who have no reason to look twice. Outside on the ordinary street, she turned up her collar against the October and thought about a boy in a cupboard and a man in a room above a chemist's and the chain of reasoning that kept them precisely where they were. The reasoning was sound. She had checked it herself, from every angle she could find. It was still the most cold-blooded thing she had encountered outside of wartime. She walked to the corner where she could disapparate without being seen, and she went. Wisteria Walk was exactly the kind of street that had never in its life done anything remarkable, and was deeply committed to continuing in this vein. The houses were identical in the way of houses, built by someone who had one good idea and executed it 37 times in a row. The gardens were maintained with the competitive precision of neighbors who had never spoken frankly to each other about anything, and were engaged instead in a years-long territorial negotiation, conducted entirely through the medium of edging. There was not a shooting star in sight, which was something. Because the last time Dedalus Diggle had been in this general vicinity, the shooting stars situation had gotten rather out of hand. He had not planned to come back. He had made his report to Dumbledore. He had sat in the office and watched Dumbledore not be surprised, and McGonagall contained something he had never seen contained in her face before. He had received his thanks and his implicit dismissal, and he had left with his violet hat and his receipt from the car park machine, and he had gone home and spent 3 weeks telling himself he had done what he could. He had not been able to manage a 4th week of it. The woman who answered the door at number 7 had straggly gray hair and was wearing an apron that suggested she had been in the middle of something involving cats. which was confirmed approximately 2 seconds later when a large tabby appeared from somewhere around her ankles and regarded Diggle with the assessing intelligence of an animal that has long since decided that humans are broadly to be tolerated but not trusted. "Yes?" said the woman. Diggle had prepared a cover story. The cover story involved him being from the council, which he was aware was both vague and unconvincing, and he had the violet hat working against him in any case. He took it off. Then he said, instead of anything he had prepared, "I'm Dedalus Diggle. I knew about the boy, the one across the way. I was wondering if you did too." The woman looked at him for a long moment over the top of her glasses. "You'd better come in," she said. Her name was Arabella Figg, and her sitting room was furnished primarily by cats and the evidence of cats, and by the particular smell of an enclosed space that has housed felines in significant numbers for an extended period. There were photographs on the mantelpiece, several of which appeared to be of cats on their own, and several of which appeared to be of cats with a woman who might have been Mrs. Figg at various points over the years. The sofa had the look of upholstery that had accepted its fate and made a kind of peace with it. Diggle sat down on it, and a ginger cat immediately appeared on the arm beside him and stared at him. "That's Tufty," Mrs. Figg said, sitting across from him. "He does that. You get used to it." Diggle looked at Tufty. Tufty looked at Diggle. The negotiation reached an acceptable middle ground, and Diggle returned his attention to Mrs. Figg. "You know who I am," he said. It was not quite a question. "Dumbledore mentioned you, among others." She folded her hands in her lap with the composed patience of a woman who has spent a great deal of time waiting for other people to arrive at the point. "How did you find me?" "The boy's neighborhood. I wanted to know if anyone nearby was keeping an eye out, and you were." He gestured vaguely. "You seemed like someone who might be." She looked at him with the expression of a woman recalibrating her initial estimate of a person's intelligence upward, very slightly, against a considerable prior expectation. "I've been here since before he arrived," she said. "Dumbledore arranged it. I'm on Wisteria Walk. The Dursleys are on Privet Drive. Close enough to watch, but not so close as to seem deliberate." "What's your arrangement? With the boy?" "I babysit him," she said, "when the Dursleys go out. They leave him with me because I'm conveniently placed and because they like having somewhere to put him that isn't the house, and I don't refuse, because refusing would end the arrangement, and then I couldn't watch. I make the visits dull. I show him photographs of the cats." She said this without apology, but also, Diggle noticed, without any particular comfort. It keeps the Dursleys from suspecting I have any real interest in the child. If they thought I cared about him specifically, they would stop bringing him here, and if they stopped bringing him here, I would lose most of what I have. So I make the visits dull, and the boy comes and he sits on my sofa, and I watch. She said the last word the same way one might say I report for duty, not unkindly, but with the precise weight of someone who understands that the word contains a great deal that is not comfortable. "What have you seen?" Diggle asked. She looked at him steadily. "What do you know already?" "The report I gave Dumbledore. The thin build, the oversized clothes. I saw him briefly in a shop. A few minutes, maybe." "I saw." He stopped. "I saw what I saw. But you've been here 4 years. What have you seen?" She uncrossed and recrossed her hands. One of the other cats, a small white one that he supposed was either Snowy or Mr. Paws, appeared from behind the sofa and jumped onto the cushion beside her. She did not look at it. She was still looking at Diggle. "He's a quiet child," she said. "I want you to understand what I mean by that. I don't mean well-behaved. I mean the other thing, the kind of quiet that children learn when they've understood that making noise has costs. He doesn't ask for things. He doesn't complain. When the Dursleys leave him here, and I put him on that sofa, and I show him photographs of the cats, and offer him whatever I have that's unremarkable enough not to seem like I'm being kind to him on purpose, he says thank you, and sits very still and doesn't reach for anything without asking." She paused. Most children that age reach for things. That's what they do. They see something and they reach for it and you say, "Careful," or "Wait," and they push a bit and you hold the line. He doesn't do that. He waits to be told what to do, and he does it, and he doesn't expect anything to come after. That's not a happy child's quiet. That's a child who has done some calculation, young as he is, and the calculation has come out a particular way. Diggle was looking at the cat on the sofa arm. The cat had stopped looking at him and was cleaning its face with the untroubled dedication of an animal with no investment in the conversation. "The cupboard," he said. He had heard this from McGonagall already, who had heard it from somewhere she hadn't specified, but he wanted to hear it said in this room, by this woman who had been here. Mrs. Figg's expression did not change. "Under the stairs," she said. "I've been past the house at the right time of day. I've seen him come out of it, 4 years old the first time I saw it, or close to. He climbs out and he closes the door behind him, and he goes to do whatever he's been told to do, and there is nothing in how he does it that suggests he finds it unusual, which is perhaps the worst thing about it. The unusual thing would be if he found it unusual." The room was very quiet for a moment. From somewhere further in the house came the sound of a cat doing something that required movement and then stopping. "Dumbledore knows," Diggle said. It came out not as an accusation, but as a man confirming something he has been trying not to confirm. "You report to Dumbledore." "Yes." "So he knows about the cupboard." "I have written to him about the cupboard," she said carefully. "Whether he knows it as I know it, sitting in that house, that I can't say. I know he has my reports." Diggle set his hat on his knee and looked at it. It was a very good hat. He had worn it the night Voldemort fell, when he had stood in his back garden in Kent and watched the shooting stars he'd sent up, and felt the kind of joy that doesn't reckon with what is being built in its wake. He had worn it every day since, and never once thought about what the morning after joy required. "He placed you here," Diggle said. "Yes." "He placed you here knowing what you would find." She did not answer this directly. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has had 4 years to sit with the same observation and has arrived at the same impasse. "When I was told why the boy had to stay there," she said, "the argument made sense. The charm requires the house. The protection requires Petunia. If he goes somewhere else, the thing his mother gave him, the magic she left in him when she died, it stops working. Dumbledore can't move him without losing the one certain thing. So he put you here to watch instead," Diggle said. "Yes. To watch a child in a cupboard and report and keep watching." She looked at him squarely. "To make sure he was alive," she said. "To make sure nothing worse was happening. To hold the line between what is difficult and what is the other thing." He supposed this was true. He supposed that somewhere in the logic there was a line, and that Arabella Figg was standing at it with her cats and her photographs and her deliberately dull visits, and that without her the line would be unwatched. He supposed this was a form of care, because it was the only form available, and that Dumbledore had chosen it deliberately, because there was nothing else to choose. His impulsive bow in the shop. His report. McGonagall in Dumbledore's office with her contained expression. Lupin somewhere in a set of lodgings above a chemist's with his unworn grief. And Arabella Figg here for 4 years, watching a boy learn to be quiet, and reporting to the man who had placed her here knowing what she would find. It was not a failure in the arrangement, he understood. That was what he had to sit with, now that he was sitting with it. He had thought, without quite thinking it, that his report might have uncovered something Dumbledore didn't know, some gap in the plan that could be fixed. He had thought this because the alternative, that Dumbledore knew, that the plan accounted for all of it, that the cupboard was not a mistake but a premise, was considerably harder to hold. He stood and picked up his hat and thanked her. She saw him to the door. On the path, the white cat that he now thought might be Snowy appeared from the side of the house and watched him leave. He went down Wisteria Walk without hurrying and without knowing where he was going, which was, he reflected, precisely the condition he'd been in when he arrived. She did not come to him immediately. She had learned, over 30 years of disagreeing with Albus Dumbledore, that arriving with a position was less effective than arriving with a case, and a case required assembly. She spent a week after her visit to Wisteria Walk writing down what she knew, not what she suspected, not what she felt, but what she could demonstrate, specifically with a source attached to each item. The cupboard. Arabella Figg, who had been placed at that address by Dumbledore himself, and whose account was therefore not the impressionism of a stranger passing through, but the sustained observation of a woman who had been there for years. The clothes. Diggle, who had stood within arm's reach in a shop aisle and described the shirt in enough specific detail that she was confident he was not embellishing. The car crash. The story the Dursleys had chosen to tell a child about how his parents had died. She wrote that one down last and looked at it for a while before she moved on. She brought it to Dumbledore on a Thursday afternoon in November, when the castle was quiet and there was sufficient time. She did not want to be interrupted. She went to his office and found him at his desk with a cup of tea that had gone cool, and she sat without being asked and put the pages on the surface between them and said, "I would like you to read these before we discuss them." He picked them up. He read without rushing. She waited, which she was good at, and watched his face, which she was also good at, though Dumbledore's face had never offered much to those who watched it uninvited. When he set the pages down, he folded his hands and looked at her over his half-moon spectacles. "Arabella has been thorough," he said. "Arabella has been here for 4 years," McGonagall said. "She has been thorough because you placed her there and asked her to be, and she has been, and this is what thoroughness looks like when you apply it to Harry Potter's daily life." Dumbledore did not flinch. She had not expected him to. "Minerva." "He is sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs," she said. "His aunt and uncle have told him his parents died in a car accident. He is dressed in clothes purchased for a different child, and he has developed, at 4 years old, the particular quietness of a child who understands that drawing attention to himself has costs. These are the facts. I would like to discuss what you intend to do about them." "What I intend to do about them," Dumbledore said, "must begin with the same consideration it has always begun with. Harry is alive. He is in Surrey, on an unremarkable street, in a house that is, whatever else it is, the location where Lily's protection holds. The blood magic she created requires his presence in that house. It requires that he call it home. So long as that condition is met, no dark magic can touch him at that address. And that is not a small thing, Minerva. That is not something to put in the balance lightly against the weight of the cupboard." "I am not putting it lightly," she said. "I understand the charm. I have understood it since you explained it to me in 1981. What I am asking is not whether the charm is real. I am asking what we owe the child beyond keeping him magically insulated from a threat that is currently a formless remnant without a body." "We owe him his life," Dumbledore said quietly. "That is what the arrangement guarantees." "Voldemort," she said, and her voice was level, "is a wraith. He is scattered and disembodied and not capable of direct action. His followers who were not imprisoned are hiding or repenting or going about their days. The immediate threat is—" She stopped herself. "I am not saying there is no threat. I am asking how large the threat is, in its current form, weighed against the conditions of that house. Because from where I am sitting, the threat is theoretical and the conditions are documented." "The threat is theoretical until it is not," Dumbledore said. "I have learned, rather painfully, not to confuse the dormancy of evil with its absence. Voldemort will return. I do not know when and I do not know how, but he will return, and when he does, Harry must be protected. The charm is the only certain protection I can give him. I will not trade it for comfort." She looked at him. He met her eyes without difficulty, which was what he always did, and which she had long since stopped finding as reassuring as she once had. "You could put him somewhere else," she said, "and maintain monitoring, and build other protections around him. There are ways to protect a child that do not involve leaving him in a cupboard under a staircase." "Not with magic that is certain," Dumbledore said. "Every other protection we might construct has a counter, has a weakness, has a gap through which, given sufficient time and motivation, an enemy can pass. Lily's magic has no counter because it was built from something that cannot be legislated against, from a mother's choice to die in her child's place. That specific magic, rooted in that specific sacrifice, is the only thing of which I am completely certain. Everything else is probability. Then the probability. The probability is not good enough," he said, with the quiet finality of a man who has done the arithmetic and arrived at the same answer every time and no longer bothers showing his work. "Not for Harry. Not for what he is and what he will need to be." She sat with this for a moment. He was not wrong about the magic. She was aware that he was not wrong about the magic, which was part of what made the conversation so costly. She moved on. "The second thing you've always said," she said, "that he must not know who he is. That growing up in the legend of himself would make him— what was the word you used in 1981? I believe I said it would not serve him well. He must not know he's famous," she said. "He must be raised without the particular deformation that comes from being worshipped before you've done anything to earn it. I take the point. I took it in 1981. But I want to say something about it that I don't think I said clearly enough then. You could tell him the truth of who his parents were without telling him that the wizarding world has built shrines to him, Those are not the same disclosure. He could know that his mother and father loved him and died protecting him. That is not a legend. That is a fact. Without knowing that every witch and wizard in Britain still speaks his name in a particular tone of voice. Keeping him ignorant of the worship does not require keeping him ignorant of the love. The office was quiet. Outside, the phoenix on its perch shifted with a small sound like a note that hadn't quite decided to be music yet. Dumbledore did not answer immediately. She noted this. She filed it away. "The third point," he said at last, which she recognized as the move of a man declining to concede the second directly. "Obscurity. A Muggle suburb offers Harry a form of safety that a wizarding household cannot, because any wizarding household known to contain Harry Potter becomes a target. The Dursleys, by virtue of being precisely what they are, offer him invisibility in the Muggle world that no magical protection can replicate. He is not findable at Privet Drive because there is no reason for anyone to look for him there. He's findable at Privet Drive by everyone who assigned a rotation," she said. "He's findable by Diggle, who found him in a shop by accident and bowed to him in front of his uncle. The obscurity argument has a gap in it, and the gap is that the people who are watching him know where he is. The people who are watching him are people I trust." "Diggle," she said deliberately. A brief pause. "My trust is not without nuance," he said. She almost laughed. It came and went very quickly. "Albus." She set her hands on the pages between them, not aggressively. She was not an aggressive woman. She was a precise one, but with the intention of making clear that she was not finished and was not going to be finished until she had said the thing she had come to say. "I am not asking you to remove him from Privet Drive. I understand that you will not, and I have looked at your reasoning from every angle I can reach, and I cannot make it move. I am asking you to do something, not nothing. The boy is 4 years old. He is sleeping in a cupboard, and he has been told his parents died in a car crash, and he is wearing his cousin's sail, and he has learned to be so quiet that the woman placed there by you to watch him has noted it as the defining characteristic of his demeanor. Something is owed to that, not a plan, not a strategy, something." Dumbledore looked at the pages. He looked at them with the expression of a man for whom the pages did not contain information that was new, but whose weight was somehow different when assembled by someone else's hand. "I will write to Petunia again," he said. She waited. She knows what she accepted when she accepted Harry onto her doorstep. She knew then that there was a protection involved, and that the protection had a cost, and that the cost was her hospitality. I will remind her. I will not. I cannot guarantee it will change the texture of the arrangement in the way you're hoping, but I can remind her of what she knows. "A letter," McGonagall said. "A letter," he agreed. She picked up her pages and stood. There was nothing else to take from this conversation that she hadn't already taken, and she knew when she had found the wall of an argument and when she was wasting her time pushing against it. She would find other things to bring to him. She would continue to gather them. She was a patient woman in the end, and patient was what this required. "Minerva," Dumbledore said, as she reached the door. She paused, but did not turn. "He's not forgotten," Dumbledore said. "You know that." She turned the door handle. "I know you believe that," she said. "Good night, Albus." She went. The door closed. For a moment, Dumbledore sat without moving, in the office that was his and had been his for a very long time, with the pages on his desk that McGonagall had assembled with her careful, merciless precision. And he looked at the word cupboard in her handwriting, and something crossed his face that was not quite grief, and not quite justification, and not quite the certainty he had spoken with. And then it went away again, and he reached for his pen and began to compose a letter to Petunia Dursley. Dumbledore did not tell him why he was wanted until Severus Snape was already seated, which was characteristic. The headmaster had a long-established habit of withholding context until a person was settled and unable to leave without making a scene, and Snape had learned early enough that arriving prepared for this made it slightly less aggravating rather than not aggravating at all. The office was as it always was. The silver instruments ticking quietly on their tables, the portraits of former headmasters pretending to be asleep with varying degrees of conviction. The phoenix regarding the room from its perch with the patient luminosity of a creature for whom time had a different texture than it did for the humans it observed. Snape sat in the chair across from the desk, which was the chair one always sat in, and folded his hands and waited. "I want to tell you something about the Potter boy," Dumbledore said, which was how Snape knew this was going to be a conversation he would have preferred to avoid. He said nothing. This was a skill he had refined over many years of finding that the alternatives were worse. Dumbledore told him what had happened. A man named Diggle. Snape knew Diggle. Everyone who had ever attended a wizarding social event knew Diggle, because Diggle had a violet top hat and no instinct for restraint, had spotted the child in a Muggle shop and, despite being on what was apparently a watching rotation, had bowed to him in full view of the Muggle guardian. Had then reported, in fulsome detail, what he had observed of the boy and his circumstances. Dumbledore described the subsequent meeting in his office, the report that had made its way through McGonagall's hands and into documented form, and the account from the woman on Wisteria Walk who had been placed there for the express purpose of watching and had been watching effectively, and who had provided a thorough portrait of Harry Potter's daily conditions. Dumbledore described the conditions. Snape listened without moving. The boy was thin. He was dressed in clothes that had not been bought for him. He was housed on an ordinary night in a cupboard beneath the stairs of the house on Privet Drive, which was the house that the blood magic required him to occupy, and which was the house where no dark magic could touch him, and which was, apparently, also the house in which his guardians had assigned him an enclosed space beneath the staircase for sleeping. He did not display distress that was visible to observers, which the woman on Wisteria Walk had noted as something more troubling than visible distress, because visible distress in a child means the child still expects things to be different. The boy did not appear to expect things to be different. Dumbledore described all of this with the composed delivery of a man who has looked at the information many times and has assembled, through repetition, a professional relationship with it. Snape looked at a point just past Dumbledore's left shoulder and thought, the boy. Potter's boy. The famous scar and the famous name and the famous story that everyone in the wizarding world carried around with them like a favorite chapter from a book they'd read so many times the binding had gone. The boy who lived. He had been building, since October 1981, a very precise and functional structure of contempt around the idea of Harry Potter, and the structure had served him well. Contempt was easier than the alternative. The alternative was not a thing Snape had any intention of looking at directly. The cupboard detail did not cause him to flinch. He made sure of this. He was a man who had, over the previous 4 years, developed his capacity for not flinching into something that was nearly indistinguishable from the real absence of feeling, and he applied it now with the professionalism of someone performing a necessary technique. "He has his father's coloring," Dumbledore said. This was not a question or a point of fact, precisely. It was the kind of remark Dumbledore made sometimes that existed at the edge between information and something else. Diggle was quite specific. The untidy black hair. The thinness, though Harry's has a different origin than James's did. And the eyes? Snape said. He had not intended to ask it. It arrived in the conversation before he had properly evaluated whether to allow it, which was unusual for him and therefore irritating. Dumbledore regarded him with the mild attentiveness of someone who had anticipated the question and had chosen not to bring it up himself for reasons that probably had to do with being Dumbledore. "Lily's eyes," he said. "Yes." The office was quiet for a moment. The phoenix made a small sound that was not quite a note. Snape had known this. He had known this as a fact since October 1981, when the night had come apart in the way that it had, and he had learned what Lily had chosen and what the cost of that choice was. And he had understood, because he had always been very good at understanding things he would have preferred not to understand, that the child would have her eyes. It was not new information. He had been informed of this fact and had filed it away with the precise deliberateness of a man who understands that certain filed facts are structural to the architecture of daily function, and that taking them out and examining them serves no purpose that justifies the damage. He had never examined it. He did not examine it now. He redirected. "The accidental magic," he said. "A child his age, in an emotional household, there will be incidents. Has anyone considered the implications for the ministry?" Dumbledore looked at him with an expression that might, in someone less contained, have been described as knowing. "The trace," he said. "Yes, the trace responds to magic performed in a location, not to the specific individual performing it in a Muggle household. If the boy produces accidental magic at Privet Drive, the ministry registers it as attributable to him, but cannot distinguish between his magic and anything else. There is an advantage to that if someone is monitoring the area. There is a disadvantage if the magic is significant enough to draw investigation. I have considered it, Dumbledore said. The boy's accidental magic is, from what Arabella describes, minor. A glass of water moved, small perturbations, nothing that would flag as significant. For now, Snape said. For now, Dumbledore agreed. Snape stood. There was nothing left to extract from the conversation that would be worth the remainder of the conversation's company, and he had work to return to, and he had been given the information he had been called to receive, and his function here was complete. Dumbledore did not try to keep him. He rarely did. He understood better than most that Snape's departure was a form of processing that should not be interfered with. He went back to his own quarters. The dungeons at this hour were quiet in the particular way of deep stone, a quiet that was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of a different quality of atmosphere, something older than the castle above, in which sound simply did not feel the need to exist in the same way. He had lived here for 4 years. He had chosen the deep quiet partly because it matched the thing he was doing with his interior life, and the match was useful. He stood at his desk without sitting and looked at nothing in particular and thought, with the precision of a man doing something that was not quite feeling but was adjacent to it. Lily's death bought the boy a cupboard in Surrey. This was not a useful thing to think. He filed it under things that were not useful and would not be returned to, alongside a significant collection of other things that were not useful and would not be returned to, and the filing system was extensive, and he had become very good at maintaining it. He sat. He had not, in 4 years, allowed himself to name what Lily was to him. The naming would require him to access the full extent of the thing being named, and the full extent was not compatible with continuing to function at the level of function he required. So he had not named it. He had instead converted it, with the thoroughness of a man who understands transmutation, into something he could use, a commitment. He would protect the boy. He had said this already to Dumbledore, not in those words, not in any words at all, because Dumbledore had not needed the words, had needed only the indication, and Snape had given it. He would protect Harry Potter. Not because of the boy himself. The boy was 4 years old and sleeping in a cupboard, and Snape had never met him, and what he knew about him was a set of physical descriptions passed through 2 intermediaries, and he was James Potter's son, which was not a point in the boy's favor, but was also not the boy's fault. But because Lily had made a choice. She had stood between her child and the curse, and she had made a choice, and that choice had a shape, and the shape was Harry, and the shape had her eyes, and Lily Potter had been dead for 4 years, and Snape was not capable of protecting the dead, but he was capable of protecting what the dead had died for. This was the thing he had always known. It was the foundation of the entire structure. He had built the contempt on top of it and around it, because the foundation was not something he could afford to look at directly on a daily basis. And the contempt was a better working surface. What had shifted tonight was not the foundation. The foundation did not shift. What had shifted was something smaller and more specific, the knowledge of the cupboard. The knowledge that Lily's sacrifice, precise, complete, unrepeatable, had bought the boy a cupboard under a staircase, and that this was the thing her death was currently serving, and that he, Snape, who had set the whole catastrophe in motion by carrying a fragment of a prophecy to the wrong pair of ears, was sitting in a dungeon below a school in Scotland and teaching potions to children, and the cupboard remained. He took out a piece of parchment. He looked at it. He did not write anything on it. He was not the kind of man who wrote down what he felt, which was why the parchment was an impulse rather than a decision, and why he put it away again after a moment and sat instead in the deep quiet of the dungeons until the particular noise inside him had reached a level that was again manageable. He would protect the boy. He had always known this. Tonight, he knew where the boy was sleeping. These 2 facts were now the same fact, and they were heavier together than they had been separate, and he would carry them, as he carried everything, without saying so to anyone. He did not decide to go. That was the thing he kept returning to afterward, that there had been no decision, not in the way the word usually meant. There had been an accumulation. A morning in March when he woke up in the 4th set of lodgings in 2 years and lay there in the gray early light, counting things that had happened since October 1981. And somewhere in the counting, his body had already resolved to get up and put on his coat and go to the station, and his mind had caught up to this resolution around the time he was on the platform. And by then, the train was already coming, and the argument against going was no longer the kind of argument that stops a person. He had not told anyone. He was aware that this was the part that would matter if anyone asked. Not the going itself, which might have been forgivable, but the not telling, which was the part that made it something other than an accident. He did not tell McGonagall, who would have pointed out with precision that going was not sanctioned under any interpretation of the arrangement. He did not tell Dumbledore, which would have required more courage than he had available for the task. He told no one. He put on his coat, which was the least shabby of his 3 coats, and was therefore still fairly shabby, and he took the train south, and he thought about James. He was 27 years old. He had been 27 for 3 weeks. James had been 21 when he died, and Lily had been 21, and Sirius was in Azkaban and would presumably be older than 27 now too, if Azkaban left anything in a person that could be meaningfully called older, which Lupin suspected it did not. He was the last one. He had been the last one for 6 years, and he had been managing it with variable success. And the thing that had accumulated to the point of a train south was the specific knowledge, which was not new knowledge. He had had it for 2 years, since McGonagall had come to his lodgings above the chemist's, that James and Lily's son was 7 years old and gardening while his cousin played. He was not going to do anything. He was aware of this. He had gone over it on the train with the systematic care of a man trying to find a clause that might release him, and there was no clause. The magic required the house. The house required that Harry call it home. Any action that disrupted Harry's relationship to that house, a stranger showing up at the door, the Dursleys discovering a member of the wizarding world who had come specifically to see the boy, any intervention that made Privet Drive feel less like Harry's world and more like someone else's theater, put Lily's protection at risk, and Lily's protection was the only thing between Harry and whatever remained of the man who had killed her. The argument was complete. He had checked it from every angle over 6 years, and it did not have a gap in it, not one that he could find, and he had spent considerable effort looking. He was going to stand at the end of the street, and he was going to look, and then he was going to leave. This was not a plan. It was grief, with legs. The street was called Privet Drive, and it was in a place called Little Whinging, which was in Surrey, and it was the most ordinary street Lupin had ever stood in, which was a significant achievement given that he had grown up and taught himself to pass for ordinary in roughly the same period and had considerable experience with it. The houses were all the same house, repeated with minor variations, the same red brick, the same rectangular lawns, the same arrangement of curtains suggesting lives conducted with an eye toward the neighbor's assessment. The gardens were all attended to. The windows were all clean. There was a cat sitting on a wall at the far end that appeared to be the only thing on the street not engaged in being correctly maintained. Lupin did not belong here. This was apparent without effort. His coat was too old and too wizard in some way that he could never quite articulate, but that Muggles occasionally noticed with a small calibration of the eyes. And he had not shaved that morning because he had not thought about it until he was already on the train and he was 27 and looked, he suspected, the way 27 looks when the preceding 6 years have been particularly efficient. He turned up his collar and kept to the pavement and walked slowly, because hurrying in a street like this was also a way of being noticed. He stopped at the end of the Dursleys' stretch of garden. Number 4. Red brick, like the others. Net curtains on the ground floor, drawn enough that the interior was not visible. A car on the drive. The garden was divided from the pavement by a low hedge that had been clipped with the conviction of someone who had decided that this was what the hedge should look like and would accept no deviation from it. Behind the house, accessible through a side gate that was standing open, was a back garden that from this angle Lupin could partially see. Harry was in it. He was 7 years old, and Lupin recognized him immediately because the hair was the same unruly black mass that had declared war on the concept of lying flat, and had been fighting that war for Harry's entire life, and, Lupin knew, had been fighting the same war on James's head for the 30 years of James's life before that. The hair was James's hair exactly. It was one of those facts that arrived without softening. Here was the hair, on a different head, in a garden in Surrey, and the head it was on belonged to a child who was weeding. He was doing it methodically. Not like a child doing a chore for an allowance with the resentful efficiency of someone who wants to finish quickly. More like a child who has learned that doing a thing correctly is safer than doing it approximately. He pulled each weed with careful attention and set it aside and moved to the next, in a small area near the back fence, not the whole garden. The whole garden was large, too large for a child, just the part he had apparently been given. Elsewhere in the garden, in the fuller and sunlit part near the house, another child was playing. A large child, pink-faced, doing something with a ball that involved bouncing it repeatedly against the wall of the house. The sound came over the hedge in a regular rhythm. Bounce, pause, bounce. The large child appeared entirely unaware of the smaller child at the far end of the garden, in the way that only children are unaware of other children, absolutely, and as a matter of arrangement. Lupin stood at the end of the street with his collar up and his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked at the back of Harry Potter's head for 30 seconds, or 2 minutes or longer. He was not monitoring the time with any reliability. And he thought about walking up the path. He thought about it with considerable specificity. He could be at the side gate in 4 steps. He could go through the gate and across the garden to where the small dark-haired child was crouched at the fence, and he could sit down on the ground next to him, which would bring him to eye level. And he could say, what exactly? He had asked himself this question many times in the past 2 years and had never found an answer he could live with. He could say, I knew your parents. He could say, your father was my best friend, and your mother had your eyes, and I loved them both, and there is a whole world that you do not know exists yet, in which your name is spoken the way people speak names that matter. He could say, I am the last person left who can still hear James's voice when he laughed at something, and I cannot tell anyone about it, because the person I would tell is in Azkaban, and everyone thinks he belongs there. He could not say any of these things. He stood at the end of the street, and he understood why he could not. The magic required the house to be Harry's home. That was not a poetic requirement. It was precise and literal in the way of old magic, which did not traffic in approximation. Harry's sense of belonging to that house, however thin, however unhappy, was the condition on which Lily's protection held. If a stranger came, a stranger in a wizard's coat, speaking of a world that Harry was not supposed to know about yet, telling him things that would make Privet Drive feel like a waiting room rather than a home, then the condition was at risk. And if the Dursleys noticed. If Vernon Dursley came out the back door and found an unknown man crouched in his garden next to the boy, speaking to him, Lupin had seen Vernon Dursley's voice described, and he could extrapolate from that description what would follow. And what would follow would almost certainly include the word freak, and would almost certainly also include some version of the conclusion that the boy was not to be trusted to be left in the garden, and that conclusion might end the conditions that Lily's protection required. If the protection collapsed, Voldemort had a path. Voldemort was a wraith. Lupin knew this. Voldemort was a remnant, scattered and disembodied, unable to act directly, dangerous only in the theoretical way of things that are not dangerous yet and will be later. But later was coming, and the only thing between Harry and later was the ancient magic in him that lived there because Lily had chosen to stand in front of the curse and say no, and that magic required the house, and the house required that Harry remain in it and call it his. Lupin did not go through the gate. He stood there long enough for Harry to finish one section of the fence and move to the next, and for the large child against the wall of the house to switch to a different wall, and for the cat at the far end of the street to get down from its wall and walk off with the serene self-possession of an animal that had decided the entertainment value of the situation was insufficient. Harry did not look up. He was not aware of being watched. He moved along the fence with his methodical small attention, and his James-inherited hair refused to lie flat in the afternoon light, and he was thin in the way that McGonagall's written account had described, which was the kind of thin that does not come from being a child. Lupin turned. He walked back the way he had come. He put one foot in front of the other with the consciousness of a man making a decision that he knows he is going to have to keep making for the duration of the walk, because the decision does not stay made when the direction is away from someone you came to see. The first step was a choice. The second step was a choice. By the end of the street he was still choosing, and at the station he was still choosing, and on the train he sat with his coat on, and the compartment rocking gently around him, and he made the choice to not get off at the next stop and go back, and the choice again after that, and somewhere north of London the choosing became just sitting, and the sitting was its own kind of exhaustion. Harry had never looked up. He had not known anyone was there. He had continued weeding in his methodical way at his section of fence, and then, presumably, he had been called inside for whatever a Wednesday evening in the Dursley household contained, and the side gate had stood open in the garden, with no one on the other side of it. This was fine. This was correct. This was the outcome that the logic required, and the logic was sound, and Lupin knew the logic was sound, and none of this made the train journey north feel like anything other than what it was. He did not go back to Privet Drive after that. Not that month. Not that year. Not in the years that followed. He had made himself a promise on the train that he would not go back. Not because he had been forbidden, not because he'd been caught, but because he could not stand at the end of that street and choose to leave a second time and remain anything that functioned. Once was the most he had. He spent the rest of the train journey looking out the window at the English countryside doing its unremarkable business in the late afternoon light, and he did not look at it the way a man looks at things he is enjoying. He looked at it the way a man looks at things that are still there. The cupboard had 7 spiders in it at the start of summer, which Harry had counted because counting was something to do when the dark was the dark and the Dursleys were overhead and sleep was taking its time arriving. He had given the spiders names during the previous winter, not in a way he would have admitted to anyone, because naming spiders was exactly the sort of thing that would be called freakish, but in a private, interior way that the cupboard permitted, because the cupboard was the one place where his interior arrangements were entirely his own, and no one could come in and rearrange them. By August, the spider count was 11. He was not sure whether the 7 had had children or whether new ones had come in from the gap at the bottom where the door didn't quite meet the floor, which was the same gap that the crack of light came through when someone was in the hallway. He had learned early which sounds went with which light, the heavier footstep with the light that didn't stop, which was Uncle Vernon on his way to or from something that had nothing to do with Harry. The lighter and more frequent footstep with the briefer light, which was Aunt Petunia doing the several hundred things Aunt Petunia did in the course of a normal day, and the thunderous footstep with the light that stayed, because Dudley sometimes stood outside the cupboard door for reasons that Harry had categorized as the sort of reasons that it was better not to investigate too closely. At night, the light was usually gone. At night, the sounds overhead were the ones of people settling, the television going off, the footsteps going upstairs, the slow subsidence of the house into the particular creaking quiet of a building that has been occupied all day and is now taking stock of itself. Harry lay in his own quiet underneath all of it and listened and counted spiders in the dark with his eyes open and waited for sleep. He thought about the man with the violet hat fairly often. This was one of those interior things he would not have admitted to. It had happened when he was small, younger than he was now, maybe 4 or 5, and they had been in a shop somewhere, him and Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia, and a man in a violet top hat had seen him and bowed to him. Properly bowed, the way Harry had seen in a book once, where people bowed because a thing mattered. Not like a joke. The man had been small and had a round face and had looked at Harry as though the sight of him was something worth stopping for. Harry had told Uncle Vernon about it immediately because he'd been small enough then not to know yet which things were worth telling and which things would produce the expression Uncle Vernon's face was now so good at making. He'd said, "You see that man, Uncle Vernon? He bowed to me." And Uncle Vernon had said, in the voice that meant don't, and had said, "Get away from that man, Harry," in the voice that meant this is done now, and Harry had done as he was told, which was the other thing he'd learned by then. But he hadn't forgotten it. He'd thought about it off and on for 3 years, which, when he calculated it, was a significant fraction of his total memory. He didn't know why. There had been other things since that were more obviously worth remembering, a better or a worse day at school, a thing Dudley had done that had had consequences, a meal that was larger than usual, and he had remembered those too, and then they had faded in the ordinary way of things. The man with the violet hat had not faded, something about the bow, the way the man had looked at him specifically, not past him, not through him, not in the way that adults looked at children who were in the way, but at him, as though Harry was the thing in the room that had been looked for and found. He had not been imagining it. He was fairly certain he had not been imagining it. He was generally careful about the difference between imagining things and noticing things, because the Dursleys had a particular response to Harry's accounts of things he'd noticed that suggested they did not think much of his noticing, and over time he had learned to audit his own observations before reporting them, and sometimes to not report them at all. The bow had been real. The man had seen him. He did not know what to do with this. He thought sometimes about his parents. The car crash was the answer he had been given. His parents had died in a car crash when he was a baby, and he had been brought to live at number 4, Privet Drive, because there was nowhere else for him to go, and he should not ask about it because asking about it made things difficult in ways that lasted for several days. He had understood this early and had mostly stopped asking. He had not stopped thinking. The thing about the car crash was that it did not fit in several ways that he could not quite articulate. Not that he had reason to doubt it. He had no reason to doubt it, no counter-story, no evidence that contradicted it. But the way the Dursleys spoke about it when it came up, which was as rarely as possible, had a quality that Harry's body recognized before his brain did. A stiffening. A particular silence that arrived the way a door closing arrives, specifically and with intention. When Harry had once asked, at age 6, whether his parents had been wearing seatbelts, the stiffening had been extreme enough that he'd understood the question was in some way wrong, though he couldn't see how it could be wrong, and he had filed it with the other things he did not ask about. His parents were dead. He had come from somewhere and ended up here. The man in the violet hat had bowed to him. These were 3 separate facts that his mind moved between occasionally, without finding the thread that connected them, if there was a thread. There might not be a thread. He was 8 years old, and he lived in a cupboard, and he did not, when he was being honest with himself, expect the world to have threads in it, connecting things to other things in ways that made sense. The strange things were the other category. He had stopped calling them strange things inside his own head, because that was the word the Dursleys used, and the word the Dursleys used came with a set of associations he found unhelpful. He called them other things, internally, without a consistent name. Events, occurrences, the glass that moved, which was the clearest one, and the one he returned to most often when he was cataloging. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table in the autumn. He couldn't remember what had preceded it. Only that Uncle Vernon had said something, and there was the familiar sensation of things pressing inward, which was a sensation he'd learned to manage but not always successfully. And the glass of water in front of him had moved. Not much, 3 or 4 centimeters to the left, without being touched. He had been looking at it when it happened. He had watched it happen. He had not touched it, had not bumped the table, had not done anything that could explain it, and the water inside had sloshed the way water sloshes when a glass is moved quickly and then goes still. He had looked away from it immediately. He had already learned by 8 the particular skill of not looking at things in front of the Dursleys that he had not been supposed to cause. There was also the matter of the spiders. This was harder to explain even to himself, and he was not sure it counted, because spiders moved on their own for spider reasons that had nothing to do with him. But in the cupboard, over the course of 2 summers and 1 winter, he had noticed that the spiders did not come near him. They went around him. He would lie in the narrow space and watch them cross the wall, and they would deviate around the part of the wall near his head without appearing to notice they were doing it, in the incurious way of creatures with better uses for their attention than a person lying in the dark. Once he'd watched one that seemed to be heading directly for his hand, and he had not moved, and the spider had stopped 8 centimeters from his finger and had then turned with the air of an animal that had simply remembered somewhere it needed to be. He did not know what this meant. He held it alongside the glass of water and the 3 or 4 other events that he kept in the same internal category, turning them occasionally to see if a new angle revealed anything, and nothing new was revealed, and he put them away again. The Dursleys called what happened around him freakishness, when they called it anything. He did not find this a satisfying explanation. Not because he objected to the possibility that he was unusual. He had gathered enough evidence for that, but because freakishness was a description of how you appeared from outside, and from inside whatever this was, it didn't feel like freakishness. It felt like something that happened near him and around him, and sometimes, he thought, in response to what was happening inside him. Which was not what the word freak suggested. Freak suggested a mistake. This felt, when he was lying in the dark thinking about it carefully, like something else. He didn't have a word for what else. He did not tell anyone about the glass or the spiders. He was generally cautious about what he told people, which was not a rule he had been given, but one he had developed himself over the course of 8 years of noticing which disclosures caused which reactions and calibrating accordingly. He told Aunt Petunia the things that needed to be told so that daily requirements were met. He told Uncle Vernon nothing that wasn't directly necessary, because Uncle Vernon's responses tended to expand to fill the space available, and the space was not always comfortable to be in. He told Dudley nothing, for reasons that required very little explanation. He told the teachers at school things that were carefully selected, and he had learned this past year that selected was the operative word, because he had made the mistake once of doing well on a test that Dudley had not done well on, and the aftermath had been educational in a way the test had not. He told no one about the man in the violet hat. He had learned from the single experience of telling Uncle Vernon that this particular thing was in the category of things that produced a reaction he did not want to produce. Get away from that man. The certainty and the chill of it. Whatever Uncle Vernon had seen when he looked at the man in the violet hat, it was something that required the fastest possible erasure of the whole event, and that erasure had been applied, and Harry was left on the other side of it knowing only that the man had bowed, and that the bow had mattered, and that he was not allowed to think about this in any direction that led toward another person. He thought about it in the dark instead, which was the direction that didn't lead toward anyone. There was the bow, and the violet hat, and the round face, and the way the man had looked at him, specifically and completely, the way people looked at things they had been hoping to see. Harry did not often get looked at that way. He got looked at by Aunt Petunia in the way of someone monitoring a potential problem, and by Uncle Vernon in the way of someone deciding how much of a problem was currently present, and by Dudley in the way that Dudley looked at most things, which was a way that went directly from looking to action, without much in between. The man in the violet hat had looked at him as though Harry were not a problem or an object or an obstacle, but a person, specifically Harry, and the look had lasted only the length of a bow and had then been taken away by Uncle Vernon's voice. But it had happened. Something about the bow felt like being known by someone who was glad they knew him. He did not have the language for this yet. He was 8 years old, and he lived in a cupboard, and his vocabulary for things being unexpectedly all right was still under construction. He didn't know that there was a woman next door who had been placed on Wisteria Walk for the specific purpose of watching him, and who made her cat photographs deliberately boring because caring about him too obviously would end her access. He didn't know that a man had stood at the end of his street the summer before, looking at him through the side gate while he was weeding, and had turned and walked away, rather than do the thing he had come to do. He didn't know that the violet hat had set a very specific chain of events in motion, or that a professor in Scotland had heard about the shirt he was wearing the day of the bow, and had filed this information in the part of herself that did not forget things that mattered. He didn't know about any of it. He knew a man in a violet hat had bowed to him. Uncle Vernon had been frightened by it in the way that Uncle Vernon was frightened by things he didn't want to be frightened by, which came out as certainty and removal. And sometimes the water in his glass moved. He lay in the dark with the spiders going about their business in the polite distance, and the crack of light under the door going dark as the last Dursley went to bed. And he held the three things in no particular order, and they meant something, and he did not know what, and this was a condition he had become practiced at inhabiting. He was not hopeful about it. He had learned to be careful with hope. But there was something that was not quite hope, something less formed than that, requiring less of a future to rest in, that was present when he turned the facts over, a small and stubborn sense that the world contained more than he had currently been shown, and that this was not the kind of thing a person had to simply accept. He didn't know what to call it. He went to sleep anyway. The cafe was called something with the word cozy in it, which Diggle had always found optimistic in the way of advertising generally, and it was not quite near enough to Privet Drive to be inadvisable, but not quite far enough for complete comfort. They had been meeting here, or at similar places, every few months for the past 2 years. Fig always arrived first. Diggle suspected this was because she had learned to arrive first at things, the way people learn particular habits when they have spent enough time in situations where information arrives late and costs something. He got better at the hat every time. This was his private measure of progress. He had gone from being conspicuous in an aisle to being merely notable at a corner table, and he considered this an improvement worth acknowledging. He took it off when he came in now, which he had not always done, and he had purchased for these occasions a coat that was Muggle enough not to draw the particular attention his usual coat attracted, though he had not been able to bring himself to get rid of the usual coat, which he wore on all other occasions, and which he thought of as a form of integrity. Arabella Figg was already there with a cup of tea and one of her cats, which she transported in a basket she described to any Muggle who asked as a necessary medical accommodation, phrased in terms vague enough to discourage further questions. The cat in the basket today was Tibbles, who had regarded Diggle with the settled skepticism of an animal that has withheld its approval and is comfortable in this position. "He got a new shirt," Figg said, by way of greeting, which was how their meetings tended to begin, with the most recent observation, the thing that had happened since the previous meeting that required the most immediate noting. Diggle sat down. "Good new shirt, or still Dudley's, but newer," Someone cleared out the old one, presumably because even the Dursleys noticed it was coming apart. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He's got a room now as well, upstairs. Small one. I found this out from a woman down the street who finds me useful to talk to, because I am the right sort of listener, and she mentioned the Dursley boy's room and then mentioned, by way of contrast, the boy in the small one at the top. The cupboard. Apparently they've moved him up. I don't know when. Sometime in the past year. The woman didn't know there had been a cupboard. She only knew there was now a small room. Fig looked at her tea. I cannot decide if this is the letter working, or something that would have happened anyway, or a thing that happened for reasons entirely unconnected to any of us. She meant the letter Dumbledore had written to Petunia. Dumbledore had mentioned it, obliquely, in a reply to one of Fig's reports, and neither of them knew what it had said, or what had shifted, or whether anything had. Diggle turned this over as he ordered his own tea from the woman who came to the table, who had the air of someone who had decided not to think about the cat basket and was succeeding. When she'd gone, he said, "How is he?" This was always the question, and the answer was always the same in its general architecture, even when the specifics were different. The boy was thin, the boy was quiet. The boy did his work in the house and the garden and at school without drawing visible attention to himself. The boy had friends to the extent that children in his situation tended to have friends, which was not much. The boy had accidental occurrences around him that Fig described with the careful neutrality of a woman who had been told to observe and not to interfere, and who was deciding every time that neutrality was the appropriate register. She told him about Dudley's birthday. There had been a party, a large party, with children from the school and a table of food in the back garden on a day in the early summer when the weather had cooperated, and Harry had been present in the way of someone whose presence has not been specifically invited but whose absence would have required more organization than the Dursleys were inclined to perform. He had, by Fig's account, been given a task that kept him occupied at the edge of the party rather than in the middle of it. She had watched this from her garden, which was the right distance, and had noted it without expression, because noting things without expression was what she was here for. Harry's own birthday was in late July, and it had passed, as it did each year, without the kind of marking that birthdays tended to receive from people who were tracking them. Fig brought this up, not with emphasis, but with the factual delivery she used for all of it, and Diggle heard it land in him with the dull weight that things landed with now when they confirmed what he already knew. He had stopped being surprised by what was confirmed. He had not stopped being affected by it, which was a distinction that cost him something to maintain. "Tibbles saw him in the garden last week," Fig said. Tibbles raised one ear from the basket at the sound of his name, and then decided this did not require him to do anything further. Just for a few minutes, he was pulling something up out of the vegetable patch that shouldn't have been there. He looked at Tibbles the way children that age look at cats, interested, then deciding not to show the interest, because showing interest in things that are nice is, I think, something he has learned to be careful about. Diggle looked at the window. Outside the cafe, little whinging continued in its thorough, uninterrupted way. A woman with a pushchair, two men in matching high-visibility jackets eating sandwiches on a wall. An ordinary street on an ordinary morning in 1989, containing, somewhere in its net of houses and hedges and well-maintained vehicles, a 9-year-old boy who had learned to be careful about showing interest in things that were nice. He had a letter in his coat pocket. He hadn't shown it to Fig yet because the arrival of the letter and the content of the letter were two different things, and he was still working out what he felt about the content. He took it out and set it on the table between them. It had come by owl 2 days before, which was still the only reliable method any of them had for communication, though the owl had attracted attention at his current address that he'd had to manage with a short conversation and a longer walk away from the building. McGonagall's handwriting was the handwriting of someone who had graded essays for many decades, clear, precise, slightly impatient with the page. Fig picked it up and read it. Her face did the thing faces did when information was not new. She set it back down. "Observe, report, do not make contact," she said. "Nothing's changed." "No. I assumed nothing would change." So did I. He did not say this with bitterness. He had gone through bitter and come out the other side into something that didn't have the same heat to it. More like the cold at the bottom of a very deep thing. I think I hoped, when I sent my report 3 years ago, I think somewhere in the hoping there was a version in which reporting led to action, in which telling Dumbledore was the step before the step that changed something. And it led to Dumbledore writing a letter that possibly resulted in a slightly less inadequate bedroom. Yes? Tibbles made a sound in the basket. Fig reached over and put a finger through the wicker, and he pushed his face against it for a moment, which was his version of engagement. Diggle said, I've been thinking lately, whether knowing is worth it, whether it's better or worse. Before the bow, I was watching in the way of someone assigned to watch, and I wasn't watching for anything specific, and I didn't know the shape of it. The general understanding was that the boy was at Privet Drive and was being kept safe, and safe was vague, and vague was livable. He paused. Now I know which cupboard the spare socks were on. Now I know that his birthday passes unremarked and Dudley's doesn't. Now I know all of it, specifically, and knowing it specifically and doing nothing about it specifically is not the same moral position as not knowing and doing nothing. Fig looked at him across the table. She had the expression she sometimes had, which was not quite resigned and not quite at peace with the situation, but had in it the quality of long duration, of something looked at from every angle over a long enough period of time that the looking becomes its own relationship with the thing. I've been doing this for 8 years, she said. I was here before Harry arrived. I was placed on Wisteria Walk in preparation for his being left at number 4, because Dumbledore is thorough, and thorough means there was already a watcher before there was anyone to watch. I've had 8 years to think about what watching is and what it isn't. He waited. I think, she said, that the watching was always going to be this. I think the arrangement was always going to produce exactly what it's produced. A network of people who know, in very precise detail, what a child's difficult life looks like, and who are not in a position to alter it. I think Dumbledore knew this when he designed the arrangement, and I think he designed it anyway, because the alternative was no information, and he has decided that information is better than its absence, even when the information cannot be acted on. She picked up her cup. I'm not sure he's wrong. I've thought about whether he's wrong for 8 years, and I'm not sure. But she put the cup down without drinking from it. At what point, she said, does watching become complicity? She did not say it as though she expected him to answer. He understood from the way she said it that she had been asking it of herself for some time and had not found an answer, and that she was offering it to him now not as a question that would be answered here, over tea in a cafe called something with cozy in the name, but as the honest bottom of the thing, the question that lived at the bottom once you'd moved through all the others. He didn't answer. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him and turned it in his hands in the way he'd been turning it since he was old enough to own hats, and he looked at its violet surface and thought about a bow that he had made in a shop 3 years ago, and the chain of knowing that the bow had started, and the chain of not acting that the knowing had produced. I don't know, he said. No, she agreed. They paid for the tea. Outside, the ordinary morning continued without interest in either of them. They went in opposite directions at the corner, Diggle toward the bus stop, Fig toward Wisteria Walk and the rest of her morning's arrangements, and neither of them said anything else because the question had been asked, and it was enough, for now, to have asked it in company rather than alone. The asking didn't help with the answer, but it made the question slightly less solitary, and in the present configuration of their options, slightly less solitary was what passed for progress. Tibbles, in his basket, observed this departure from the interior of the basket with the composure of an animal that has witnessed a great many human decisions and has adjusted its expectations accordingly. The letters went out on the 24th of July, as they did every year, a quantity of parchment envelopes addressed in the distinctive emerald ink of Hogwarts' enchanted quill, carrying within them the list of required books and equipment and the knowledge that a child's life was about to change in ways the child could not yet anticipate. McGonagall had overseen the process annually for decades. She knew the rhythm of it, the enchanted quill finishing its work, the owls collecting their deliveries, the particular quality of the castle in late July when it was still quiet enough to hear itself think and would not be so for much longer. She had known for 11 years that this particular July would come. She had known that the enchanted quill would eventually address a letter to number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, and that this letter would find its recipient in a way she had spent 6 years documenting the inadequacy of its surroundings for. She had spent those 6 years assembling the case that was now assembled, and the case was complete, and she had decided, when the letters went out, that she would go to Dumbledore with it one final time before Hagrid left to collect the boy, and the plan concluded its first phase in the way that Dumbledore had always intended it to conclude. She did not stop at his gargoyle to compose herself. She had composed herself long before she arrived. She had, in fact, been composing herself for 6 years, and the document under her arm was the result. It was 12 pages. She had been precise about this. She had not written 12 pages because she felt 12 pages were required for emphasis. She was not a woman who used volume to make points, which was why her fourth years always looked briefly startled when she said something in a quiet voice. But because 12 pages were what the information required when assembled without embellishment, in strict chronological order, with each item attributed to its source, Diggle's reports, summarized and cited by date, Fig's observations, organized by year, the moment when the cupboard became a small room upstairs, which had occurred sometime in 1988 and which McGonagall had decided to enter under possible effect of letter to Petunia, possible independent development, no way of confirming. The car crash lie, the clothes, the birthday, every year, unremarked. The portrait that Fig had given her, gently and over time, of a child who had learned that displaying appetite for good things was a form of vulnerability and who had therefore stopped displaying it. She knocked. She went in. Dumbledore was at his desk. He was, as he often was in the summer, without formal robes. He wore something long and silver-grey that made him look slightly less headmasterly and slightly more like an elderly wizard sitting in the late afternoon light, which was what he was. His half-moon spectacles were on his nose. On the desk before him was a piece of parchment that she recognized, from the small distance, as something to do with staff arrangements for the coming year. She did not sit. She placed the document on his desk, on top of the staff arrangements, without comment. He looked at it. Then he picked it up and began to read. She stood. The window to the left of his desk showed the grounds in the long light of late July. The lake a dark mirror in the distance. The Quidditch pitch standing empty with the particular expectant quality of structures that know they are about to be used again. She had looked at this view from this office a very great number of times over the years, usually in circumstances that required her to occupy her eyes with something other than the person she was waiting for. She was practiced at it. He read for a long time. He read in the way he did everything, with complete attention and without any of the performance of speed that people employed when they wanted to convey that they were taking something seriously. He turned the pages. He did not speak. When he reached the end of the 12th page, he set the document down and looked at it for a moment before he raised his eyes. She had expected the calm. The calm was what she had encountered in 1985 when Diggle had made his report, and in the subsequent conversation in which she had laid out her evidence and received his 3-part defense in return, and in the years of letters and reports since, in each of which Dumbledore had responded with the measured equanimity of a man who had decided something very deeply and was not going to be moved by the territory that decision covered. She had come prepared for the calm. She had structured her 12 pages to penetrate it. His face, when he raised it, was not quite calm. It was not distraught. It was not apologetic or defensive, or any of the things faces were when they had been caught in something. It was something more contained and more honest than any of those. The face of a man who has looked at an assembled version of something he has known in its parts and has found that the whole is a different object than the parts were. "Did you know it would be like this?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she had time to hear the clock on the mantelpiece mark the quarter hour, which was something she had heard in this office many times. "I knew it would be difficult," he said. "I did not know it would be this specific." She took that in. She had expected many possible answers, and she had prepared for most of them, but this one, she found, she had not specifically prepared for. It was too honest for her prepared responses. She stood with it for a moment. "The boy is alive," Dumbledore said. Not as a deflection. She had learned the difference between Dumbledore deflecting and Dumbledore stating a fact that he believed was the weight-bearing element of the conversation, and this was the second. "Voldemort's remnant has not found him, has not, in 10 years, been able to touch him at that address. The charm held. Every component of the plan that I was certain about has held." He paused. "The components I was less certain about have produced what your document describes. I was aware that they might. I was less aware of the cumulative texture of it, committed to paper." "The cumulative texture," she said, "is a child who has spent 10 years learning that he is the least important person in his own household." "Yes." He said it plainly without dressing it. "I know. And in September he will come here," she said. Not knowing he is a wizard, not knowing his parents were murdered, not knowing that the whole of the wizarding world has been speaking his name for 10 years in a particular tone of voice, and he will need to absorb all of that in a night in a hut on a rock from Rubeus Hagrid on his way to London. That is the plan. That is the plan. And the plan. She stopped herself. She had said this before. She had said it in various forms for 6 years, and the plan had not changed, and the plan was not going to change now, and she knew this, and had known it, and had come here today not because she expected the plan to change, but because she needed it witnessed. She needed Dumbledore to sit across from 12 pages of what his plan had looked like from the inside, and to say, I knew it would be difficult without the calm, without the certainty, with the specificity of it landing on him, the way it had landed on everyone else who had had to look at it directly and remain in place. Hogwarts will be different, Dumbledore said. I know. Whatever the next 7 years require, he will be seen here. He will be taught here. He will have people here who know what he is and what he has done, and who are committed to his well-being as a person rather than merely as a... He paused at the word, a strategic position. I cannot undo the first 10 years. I would not have changed the plan even if I had known what it would look like, because the charm is the one certainty I had, and Harry needed certainty more than he needed comfort. But Hogwarts is different. I mean that. She believed him. She had always believed him about Hogwarts. Her difficulty with Dumbledore had never been about his sincerity, which she did not doubt, but about the particular shape his sincerity took, which sometimes required a child to live in a cupboard in order to be safe enough to eventually be sincerely cared for. Hagrid, she said, when he goes to collect the boy. Yes, he will tell Harry about James and Lily. He will. I want him to tell Harry about them as people, she said. I have said this to you before, and I am saying it again, and I want it to be a specific instruction to Hagrid, not a general allowance. Harry Potter will arrive at this school knowing that his father was brave and that his mother was brilliant, not just that they died. He will know that his parents were people who loved him, not only that he is famous because of how they died. I want Hagrid to give him that before he arrives. It costs nothing. It changes nothing about the plan. Give him that. Dumbledore looked at her over his spectacles. I will speak to Hagrid, he said. Yes. Good. She picked up her 12 pages from the desk. She did not know why she picked them up. She had not intended to, had assumed she would leave them as a thing left, but her hands had decided differently, and she stood there holding them with the slight absurdity of a person who has made a dramatic gesture and then immediately complicated it by picking it up again. She put them under her arm. Is that all? Dumbledore, and she thought this was the first time in a long time that she had seen him do something she could only call tired, set his hands flat on his desk and looked at them. No, he said. There is one more thing. Something for Remus to do. She looked at him. I have been thinking, he said, about the letter your document cannot cover. The things that Fig cannot observe and Diggle cannot report. What it will mean for Harry to know who he is and where he came from, not as fact, but as something felt, as something given by someone who knew his parents, who misses them. He raised his eyes. Remus is the last one who can do that. I am going to ask him to write a letter, not to be given now, when the time is right, but written now, while the grief is still recent enough to be honest and while there is still someone who can write it. She stood very still. A letter, she said, to Harry, from someone who knew James and Lily as people, not as legend. He looked at her steadily. Will you tell him, or shall I? I'll tell him, she said after a moment. She went to the door. Something had shifted in the room, not the plan, which had not shifted, and not the past 10 years, which were fixed as all past things were fixed, and would not be made better by being examined again, but something in the arrangement of what came next. Dumbledore had looked at 12 pages and not been calm, and he had said, I did not know it would be this specific, and he had said Hogwarts will be different, and he had said something for Remus to do, and these were small things against the weight of what they could not undo. But they were the things that were available, and available was what she was working with. Minerva, he said as she opened the door. She looked back. Thank you, he said, for the document, for all of them. She did not answer this. She went out and down and into the castle that would in September be different in all the ways she intended it to be different, and she began composing in her head what she would say to Remus Lupin when she wrote to him. McGonagall's letter arrived on a Thursday, which was not a day Lupin associated with anything in particular, and this seemed appropriate, because the instruction inside it was not the kind of thing that required a significant day. It was a small thing. Dumbledore wished Lupin to go to Godric's Hollow and write Harry Potter a letter to be sealed and kept until someone judged the time right. The letter should say who Harry's parents were as people, not as legend, not as the story that the wizarding world had been telling itself for 10 years. As people. He sat with the letter for a while. He was 31 years old. He had been 31 since March. He was living in his 5th set of lodgings since 1981, this one in a market town whose name he had chosen because it had a pharmacist on the corner who was discreet and a landlord who did not ask questions, and these two qualities covered most of what he needed from a place to live. He had a bookcase and a kettle and a window that faced east, which he had always preferred, because he liked to know when morning was coming. He wrote back to McGonagall to say he would go the following week. He wanted time to think about what the letter would say before he sat down to write it, because the letter was the first thing he had been asked to do for Harry Potter that was not just watching from a distance, and he intended to do it correctly. Godric's Hollow was in Devon, and he had not been there since the autumn of 1981, when the world had arranged itself into a before and an after, and he had not been able to make himself cross into the after with any deliberateness for some time. He had eventually crossed it by accident, in the way one eventually crosses most things, not by deciding to, but by living long enough that the crossing happened around him. But he had not gone back to Godric's Hollow. There had not been a reason, and he had developed since 1981 a very efficient relationship with the absence of reasons, which had allowed him to not do a great many things that would have cost him more than he had available. He went on a Tuesday in early August, on a train south and then a bus west, and then on foot into the village, which he had visited twice while James and Lily were alive, once for a summer afternoon, once for Christmas, and which he now entered for the first time as a place that had a particular weight attached to it in the world's understanding, and therefore in his. The village was a village, in the way of English villages, a square, a church, houses arranged around the two of these with the quiet conviction of structures that have been arranged this way for a long time and have no plans to reconsider. It was a summer afternoon, and the light was good, and there were Muggle tourists with guidebooks, which he had not anticipated and which made a disorienting kind of sense. The village was in the guidebooks now because of what had happened here, and what had happened here had happened to people Lupin had known as the kind of people who argued about Quidditch teams and left their cloaks on the back of chairs. In the center of the square, to Muggle eyes, there was a war memorial of the ordinary kind, an obelisk with names on it, dated from a different war. To Lupin's eyes it was something else. He had been told about it. It had been mentioned in the years since as one of the ways the wizarding world had marked the place, but seeing it was not the same as having been told about it. A statue of a family, a man and a woman and a baby, rendered in stone in the middle of this ordinary square. James and Lily and Harry, in the summer of 1991, standing in stone in the village square while elsewhere in England their son was receiving a letter from Hogwarts and their son's last surviving marauder was arriving in the village for the first time in 10 years. He did not stand at the statue for long. He was not ready to stand at it for long. The churchyard was beyond the square, through a gate in the old stone wall that surrounded the church, and he went through the gate and into the quiet of it with the intention of finding the grave and then deciding what came after. He had not brought flowers, which he thought about when he was already through the gate, and then thought, James would not have expected flowers. James would have expected him to be there and to say something that made a kind of sense, and the flowers were beside the point. The grave was not difficult to find. The churchyard was not very large, and the potter's stone was near the wall, and he found it without having to search for long, and when he found it, he stood in front of it and read the names and dates that he already knew, because knowing them as facts and standing in front of them carved in stone were apparently different activities. James Potter, born March 27, 1960, died October 31, 1981. Lily Potter, born January 30, 1960. Died October 31st, 1981. The last time they had stood, the three of them, him and James and Lily, they had all been 21. He was certain of this and had done the arithmetic many times. James had been 21 for 7 months when he died. Lily had been 21 for 9 months. 21. And then the stone. And the stone did not age. Lupin was 31. He was 10 years older than James had ever been, 10 years older than Lily. He was the age that they would have been in 1991, if 1981 had been a different year. He had lived into their 40s, and they had not, and the stone stayed at 21, regardless of how many years went past it. He stood in front of the stone and thought about this with the specific quality of attention that he gave to things he had been looking away from and had decided today to look at. He had been given a task. He would do the task. He went to the tea room on the edge of the square, which was the only place in the village that offered a table and a degree of privacy, and he sat in the corner with a pot of tea he didn't particularly want and the parchment and the pen he had brought in his coat pocket, and he thought for a while about what the letter should say. He did not want it to be the letter a person writes when they are performing the act of writing a letter, the version of themselves that is slightly improved by the knowledge of being read. He wanted it to be the letter that would have been said in a kitchen or a garden or on the stairs between one floor and another if there had been more time, the ordinary language of people who knew each other well enough to say things without ceremony. He wrote, "Dear Harry." He sat with that for a moment. Then he wrote, "Your father was my best friend, and I have been trying for 10 years to say that sentence out loud to someone who needed to hear it, and I have not been able to find the right person or the right time, and so I am saying it to you in a letter that I have been told you will receive when the time is right, and I have to trust that someone will know when that is because I do not." He wrote about James. He wrote about him as a specific person rather than a symbol, which required him to choose details rather than gestures. And the details were what he had been storing for 10 years without anywhere to put them. The way James had always known what the joke was before it arrived, so that his face was already doing the beginning of a laugh before the punchline existed. The way he had been a different person at 17 than he had been at 14, not because he had decided to improve, but because something in him had expanded to accommodate more than itself. The way he had turned his instinct for loyalty, which had always been there, impulsive and large, into a thing that he was willing to pay serious costs for. He wrote about the animagus transformation. He wrote it carefully, because the story of the marauders had gaps in it that he still could not look directly at, gaps that wore the faces of people who were dead or who had done things that he could not yet reconcile with what he had known. But the core of the story was James's. Your father learned to become an animal, a stag, in the hardest of circumstances, because his friend was a danger to himself and to others once a month, and James decided that the appropriate response was not to withdraw from the friend but to meet him on his own ground. This is the kind of loyalty that most people describe in the abstract and very few perform in practice. Your father performed it. He wrote, "He defended your mother and you, wandlessly, on the night that Voldemort came to your house. I need you to understand that this means he had no weapon and he stood there anyway, because the people he loved were behind him." Then he wrote about Lily. This was in some ways harder, because Lily's death was not only a death, it was a choice, made with full knowledge of what the choice meant, and writing about that choice to her son required him to say it plainly, without the kind of framing that would turn it into something noble and distant. He did not want noble and distant. He wrote, "Your mother was brilliant in the way that meant she understood things faster than most people. But that was not the most important thing about her. The most important thing was that she looked at people, really looked at them, the way not many people bother, and she saw what they were, not just what they showed. She saw your father when he was still in the process of becoming himself, and she saw what he was going to be before he arrived there. She had dark red hair and your eyes, which is to say, she had eyes that were a very specific green. And when she looked at you the night that you were born, she said something I wasn't there to hear, but your father told me later, and I have not forgotten it. She said, 'Here you are,' as though she had expected you and was glad the wait was over." He wrote, "You are loved, not because of the scar, not because of what happened and what you may be asked to do because of it in the years to come. As yourself. There are people who have been watching you from a distance for reasons you will come to understand, and who have not been able to do what they wanted to do for reasons that are also real. But underneath all of it, underneath the reasons and the strategy and the plan, you are loved, specifically and personally, in the way that you can only be loved by people who knew your parents and who see James's hair on your head and Lily's eyes in your face and feel, every time, the exact size of what was lost and the exact size of what was not." He put the pen down. He looked at the letter. It was not long enough. It could never be long enough, because the things it was trying to carry were heavier than paper could hold and had been compressed by 10 years of nowhere to go. But it was true. Which was the thing he had decided, walking through the churchyard to the tea room, that he would allow as the one sufficient criterion. If it was true, it was enough. The truth did not require him to be eloquent. It required him to have been there. He sealed it. He addressed it. Harry James Potter. No further direction. He would give it to Dumbledore, and Dumbledore would give it to someone, and someone would know when. He paid for the tea and went out into the August afternoon. The square was quieter than it had been when he arrived. The Muggle tourists had moved on to other things. The statue in the center was a family in stone in the afternoon light, and he did not look at the ruin of the house at the other end of the village, which was still standing, which was still a shell, which was still the shape of what it had been. He did not go to the ruin. He had done what he came to do. He walked back through the village to the place where he had arrived, and the letter was in his coat pocket, and it was not enough. He was clear-eyed about this. He had been clear-eyed about it since the decision to write it had first arrived, that nothing available was going to be enough. But it was the true thing, written in ordinary language, in a tea room in the village where his best friends had died, and it would be there when someone decided the time was right, and Harry would be older then, and it would still be true. That had to be its own kind of enough. He disapparated from the lane beyond the church and went home, and the stone in the churchyard remained where it was, as it always had, keeping the names at 21 while the years went past. He arrived at the Leaky Cauldron an hour early, which was not a thing he had planned to do. He had planned to arrive at a reasonable time, perhaps 20 minutes before Hagrid was expected, perhaps half an hour. But when he woke that morning and lay in bed with the knowledge of what day it was, the reasonable time had not held. He had got up and put on his best robes and put on the violet hat and gone out into the August morning with the whole of London doing its sprawling, indifferent business around him, and he had walked to Charing Cross Road and stood outside the Leaky Cauldron for a moment before he went in, because he wanted to stand outside it for a moment, on the ordinary street, and remember that most of the world had no idea what was about to happen in the grubby pub on the other side of the wall. Inside, Tom behind the bar gave him the nod and poured him something he didn't drink, and Diggle sat at a corner table with his hat on the table beside him and waited. 6 years since the bow. He thought about the shape of it, as he had thought about it many times since, but today with the particular quality of attention that came from knowing that the thing set in motion was nearly completed. The bow. An impulse that he had not controlled, in a Muggle shop in Surrey, on an afternoon when the rotation was slow, and the hat was conspicuous, and a small dark-haired boy had turned around from the cereal display and looked at him. He had bowed. He was the kind of man who bowed when something moved him, and the sight of Harry Potter in an ordinary shop wearing a shirt that could have served as rigging had moved him in 2 directions at once. The direction of joy, which was the instinct toward the famous scar and the boy who lived and all of it, and the direction of something colder, which was the shirt. He'd reported the shirt because the shirt was the part that mattered, and the report had led to McGonagall coming to Dumbledore's office with her steady and controlled fury, and McGonagall going to Lupin in his lodgings above a chemist's, and Diggle himself going back to Wisteria Walk and finding Arabella Figg and sitting in her cat-attended sitting room while she described a quiet child who had learned not to reach for things. He thought about Lupin's face when McGonagall had first told him. He hadn't been there, but McGonagall had told him about it, and the specific word she had used was devastated, in the way of someone for whom devastated was an understatement that he lacked a better word for. He thought about the meeting with Figg at the cafe 3 years later, when she had asked the unanswerable question at the bottom of all their conversations, and they had walked away from it in opposite directions. He did not regret the bow. He had thought about this carefully, because the question of whether the bow was the right thing had been with him for 6 years, and he had concluded, after considerable examination, that the regret he carried was not the regret of having bowed. The regret was of a different shape. He regretted that the bow had not been enough. He regretted that an impulsive act of joy in a Muggle shop had not somehow, when he had reported it upward and it had moved through McGonagall and Lupin and Figg and Dumbledore's office, resolved into something larger than it was. He had started something. He had expected the something he started to grow into something actionable, and it had not grown that way. And this was a different regret than regretting the start. He thought about what had changed. There was a letter somewhere, with Dumbledore, that Lupin had written in a tea room in Godric's Hollow, and sealed and addressed without a delivery date, that Harry Potter would receive when someone decided the time was right. Diggle didn't know what it said. He didn't need to. He knew that Lupin had written it, because McGonagall had told him, and he knew what Lupin writing a letter cost and what Lupin writing a letter meant, and that was sufficient. There was Hagrid, who today had collected the boy from wherever the boy had been, and who had been instructed to say more than the minimum about James and Lily, to give Harry a version of his parents that was people rather than legend. Diggle had not been in that conversation, but he knew what the instruction had been and what Hagrid was capable of when given latitude, which was warmth in large quantities and an endless willingness to tell stories about people he had loved. There was Dumbledore's letter to Petunia, written years ago now, the quiet reminder of what she knew and what was required of her, and the small room Harry had instead of the cupboard, which may or may not have been its consequence, and which was not large enough, and which Diggle had filed under, better than nothing, alongside a great many other things that occupied that particular category. There was the network itself, 6 years of Fig on Wisteria Walk with her cats, and her carefully cultivated dullness, watching, 6 years of Diggle on rotation, watching, McGonagall's 12 pages, assembled and placed on a desk. Watching that had produced knowledge, and knowledge that had produced small adjustments and small adjustments that had not been rescue. Watching that had been, for the boy himself, entirely invisible. Harry Potter had lived his childhood not knowing that any of it existed, which was the intended condition, which was what the plan required, and which Diggle had spent 6 years understanding was both necessary and the most quietly devastating aspect of the whole arrangement. He, who never had much sense, had built this network by accident, by a bow. The door of the leaky cauldron opened. Diggle had been watching the door without quite meaning to for the past hour, the way one watches a thing one is waiting for without having decided to watch it. When the door opened and Hagrid came through it with the boy beside him, Diggle knew immediately and completely that this was the moment, not because it required recognition, though it did, but because the whole of the morning and the morning's thinking had been building toward a door opening and a boy coming through it, and here it was, and here he was. Hagrid was enormous, as Hagrid always was, and filled the entrance of the pub with his usual comprehensive presence. At his side, very considerably smaller, was Harry, the black hair, the same wild refusal to lie flat, sticking up at the back with the unconcerned permanence of something that had made its decision long ago and was not revisiting it. He was 11 now. Diggle did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way he always did when he thought about this particular child, and thin in the way that he had been thin in the shop, which was not the ordinary thinness of a growing boy, but the particular shape of 10 years of being the least important person in his household. He was looking around the leaky cauldron with the expression of someone experiencing a significant number of new things at the same time and trying to process them in order of urgency. His eyes, when they moved around the room, were Lily's eyes. This was not a new fact. Diggle had known it since the shop 6 years ago when he had looked across a cereal aisle and seen green in a child's face that he had last seen in Lily Potter's. He had carried this fact for 6 years alongside everything else he had carried, but seeing it again, in the leaky cauldron, on a Tuesday morning in August, with the pub filling up around them and witches and wizards becoming aware of who had just walked through the door, the fact arrived with the full weight of all 6 years behind it. Diggle stood up. He made his way through the pub, which was beginning to have the quality of a room where something was happening. People rising from their stools and chairs with the instinct of those who understand that a particular kind of occasion has arrived. He did not wait for the crowd to form. He was already moving. Harry saw him at a distance of perhaps 4 meters, and his eyes went through the sequence that Diggle had come to know across 6 years of thinking about it. The initial sweep of recognition for something familiar, the slight pause of a mind working back through its records, and then the specific arrival, the violet top hat, the small round face, the man from the shop, and Harry's expression changed in the way it had changed in the shop, briefly and completely. Diggle reached him and took his hand and pumped it up and down with the enthusiasm of a man who has been waiting 6 years for the opportunity and has no intention of understating its significance. "He remembers," he said, to the room, to the pub, to no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously. "He remembers me." Harry was looking up at him. Diggle was not tall, and even so Harry had to look up, which said something about the 10 years at Privet Drive that Diggle was not going to say aloud, with the expression of a boy encountering something that he had been holding in the back of his mind for a long time, and that had just acquired, unexpectedly, confirmation. "You bowed to me," Harry said, "in a shop, when I was small." "I did," Diggle said, In a shop. Yes. He released Harry's hand, because pumping it indefinitely would eventually become a different kind of attention, and there were others in the pub who wanted their moment, and he stepped back and stood at the edge of the growing circle of people and watched Harry's face move through the experience of being known by a large number of strangers. He would not say what the bow had set in motion. He would not say about the years of watching, or the network, or the 12 pages, or the letter sealed in Godric's Hollow, or the instruction to Hagrid, or any of it. Harry Potter would not know these things today, and might not know them for years, and might not know all of them in his lifetime. And this was the correct condition. What Harry needed today was Hagrid and Diagon Alley and the Hogwarts letter and the beginning of what came next, and not the shadow history of the 6 years that had preceded it. But he remembered the bow. He had been small, and a stranger had looked at him in a shop, had seen him specifically, and had done a thing that said you are worth seeing, and he had carried it for 6 years in the part of him where such things are stored. He had told Uncle Vernon about it immediately, because he had been small enough not to know yet that the things that mattered should be kept close, and Uncle Vernon had said, and taken it away, and Harry had carried it anyway, in the place where Uncle Vernon couldn't reach. Diggle stood at the edge of the circle in the leaky cauldron with his violet hat in his hand, and he watched Harry Potter begin the morning that would change everything, and he felt something that was not quite satisfied and not quite at peace and not quite the resolution he had been hoping for 6 years ago, when he had thought that a report to Dumbledore would lead somewhere immediate and actionable. He felt glad, simply and specifically glad, which was a smaller thing than what he had wanted and a truer thing than what he had feared, and which was, for Dedalus Diggle, who had never had much sense and